Hey everybody, welcome back. So we are still in chapter 4. It's actually chapter 4 of the Dessler book, and still, as I said, chapter 3 of the American Management Association book. But they kind of go together. So we're doing them together. We just did our first video, and that was on the job analysis and talent management, the job description, job specification, all of that stuff. And now we're going to do one other video. I'll try to keep it not too long, and that is about the idea of recruiting. So we talked first about the fact that before you recruit people, before you get a pool of people together, you need to know exactly what kind of job you're recruiting for. Sorry, I want to get a keyboard cover in case I spit all over my computer. So, before you can recruit people to do a job, you need to have a job analysis. You need to really understand, and I'm talking about real HR. I'm not talking about if, you're starting a little tiny company and you just want to hire a video producer, graphic editor, internet web designer or something. You can go on intuition. You can, for a small company. But as you get into a larger company, in professional HR, you really do need to know how to use ONET, how to use OOH, how to use HRIS systems, how to use the balanced scorecard in a digital dashboard, and of course, the actual steps of recruiting. So in a big firm, nobody's recruiting for a job without a job analysis, without a job requirements matrix, without a competency model. These things are kind of absolute basic foundation level requirements. Once we have those, we can now get into a discussion of recruiting. Now that we have the job analysis, the job description, the job specification, the job requirements matrix, and the triangle competency model, now that we have all that stuff, we can start talking about workforce planning and recruiting. Now, the way I think of this is actually a 9-step process. So we start this process with this idea of what are we doing here? We're planning. Recruiting is not just waiting until you need someone and then saying, oh my God, someone, they quit. Oh God, there's a pandemic. Oh my God, the economy's bad. Oh my God, whatever, one of our businesses went out of business and, oh my God, we need to hire people. We need to fire people. That's not good HR, of course. And we need to plan these things in advance. And so workforce planning is this process of reviewing periodically, maybe it's every 6 months, every year, every 3 months, reviewing the people you have in your organization and whether you see them leaving, staying. Do you think you need new people? Do you think you need to get rid of some of these people? What positions are still open? This is just something that we do in a business every once in a while. It's not that different from doing inventory in a store and seeing what products do you have, what do you need to order. So for most jobs, we call this workforce planning. When you get to executive jobs, there's a special name for this, which is called succession planning. Because once somebody leaves your company at a higher level, a senior manager, a vice president, something like that, it's not just about finding a new person, because at that level, you really need the right person. Having the wrong senior manager can cost the business a fortune. It can cost so much money. And the process of hiring somebody for those kind of jobs can be quite expensive. So it's very important to understand who can we promote maybe into one of those positions if nobody's ready for that. Is there some training that someone needs? This is part of workforce planning, is understanding what kind of training do people need in order to get to a senior management position or middle management. So we have these steps, right? So we start with figuring out what are we forecasting, right? So what are we, how many people do we need? Then once we know that, and then we can forecast, once we can do that, then we can start recruiting people. Then we get a candidate, we have them fill out an application form, that narrows down the candidates. Then we're gonna use selection tools. That's gonna be next week's lesson. That narrows down people even more. And then I don't know what this says, and then they become an employee. So let's talk about this recruitment process. Actually, I do know what that says. What does that say? Supervisors and other interview And others interview final candidates. Okay, so that's a second round interview. Sure. So these are the steps that I want to talk about for this specific part, recruitment, which is we start with this workforce succession planning. We start by sitting down with the people in HR and talking about, okay, how many people do we need? How many people do we have that maybe we can let go of? Do we think anybody's going to quit? I mean, just in general, looking at our workforce. What we're going to do after that is forecast. We'll start to figure out what do we think is going to happen in the future. Then we will use a workforce planning system, which is probably internet-based at this point. Then we'll talk about both internal versus external recruiting. Then we'll talk about if we want to target diversity in any way. Once we have that sort of 4, 5, 6 done, we start to create our application forms. What kind of forms are we going to have people use? We also want to create advertisements. And then we'll start to prepare for the interview. The only thing we're not putting in this is the selection tools, because that is a whole other subject that's really important that we're going to talk about. Okay, so step 1, workforce succession planning, I just explained. Every 3 to 6 months, you sit down, you figure out what inventory do you have now for people? What are your human resources? Do you need to replace people? Are you happy with them? Do you think they'll leave? What are their contracts? When are they ending? You just take a look at the whole human resource situation. Then we need to forecast. So let's go forward to forecasting. Oh, I can't go backwards. Let's do workforce planning first. So workforce planning is figuring out, using, as I said, internet, computer-based models, right now in the city where our business is, what's the workforce like? So in our first step of figuring out our projections, our succession planning and workforce planning, we figured out that maybe we might need to hire some new people this coming quarter, this 3 months. And maybe a couple people are going to leave and whatever. This is what we think is happening. Well, what's the hiring situation like? So we can look at demographics for the city that we're in using the internet. We can look at labor scans, to see in this market right now, are there, let's say we're running a cleaning company, like the Carter Cleaning Company. Are there many non-exempt employees, many hourly workers? If there aren't, maybe we shouldn't open another business in this city. Maybe we should open it in another city that has a larger labor pool of non-exempt employees. We can get that information from the internet. We can scan the workforce. We can do a projection model to see what kind of people are available in this area. We can look at dashboards. We can do all this stuff online to see right now the kind of people that we want to hire, what's their availability in this area. Then we forecast. So with forecasting, we look at a variety. There's a bunch of ways to forecast. We'll just talk briefly about 3 ways: trend, ratio, and scatter plot. So trend is the most common. With a trend, we're just looking at historical data. So let's say for the past 5 years in our company, how many people have left? Well, let's say in our company, every year, approximately between 2 and 6 people have left. And every year, how many people have we had to fire? Well, let's say every year we've had to fire between 5 and 10 people. We just look at these past years and figure, based on the historical data, how many people do we think will quit this year, or how many people do we need to fire this year? Trend analysis is just looking at the trends, just looking at the past years and making decisions for hiring and firing based on that. Ratio analysis is looking for a common factor. For example, every winter we need to hire more people, or let's say we're seasonal. For a cleaning company, maybe every winter they need more people because people take out their sweaters and their clothes that have been in a box all summer and they want to get them cleaned before they wear them for the winter, or vice versa. Maybe at the beginning of each season, maybe they find that there's more children's clothes being washed in the summer, and they could have a special discount for children's clothes. Looking at a ratio of one factor. So the factor in my example was the season or the weather. Another factor could be the time of day. If we decide that from 8 in the morning to 11, we need 3 people in the store. But in the afternoon, we only need 1 person in the store because it drops off and most people bring in their cleaning in the morning. That would be another factor. And you could call this a trend, but trend is typically when we're talking about employment levels. Now we're not talking about employment, we're talking about how many people are needed based on different factors. So do we need more people in the morning, the afternoon? Maybe we need to double our staff on the weekends, right? All of that is going to be a ratio analysis. And then a scatter plot is when we're talking about 2 different factors, not just one factor. So the example they give in the book is in a hospital. So they wanted to know for this hospital, the HR department wanted to know how many nurses should we hire. Now they could use a trend analysis and they could look at the past 5 or 10 years and see how many nurses do we need each season and how many people quit and how many people do we have to fire, and they could decide based on that. Or they could look at a ratio analysis, for example, the season, the weather, things like that. With a scatter plot, what they looked at was the number of beds and then how many nurses are needed for that number of beds. So for a 200-bed hospital, which is over here, then they figured a 200-bed hospital has this many nurses and a 300-bed hospital is this many nurses. They just did research and found different size hospitals have different numbers of nurses, and they put these dots on an XY axis. And then they draw a line that is as close as possible between the dots. And what that gives them is a general, we call that a scatter plot. It gives you a general trend line or ratio line. And then if you have a 1,200 bed hospital, approximately how many nurses do you need? Well, you have these points that have given you this line, and this line then tells you probably how many nurses do you need. So that's about looking at 2 different factors. Here's the size of beds and the number of nurses to be able to draw a line. So if we wanted to do that in the Carter Cleaning Company, we might look at the number of items brought in versus the number of employees. And we would try to get information on other firms, really big chain stores, small mom and pop stores, different stores, to see for how many items they have brought in, how many customers bring in items, how many employees do they have. From that, we get a line, and then we know for each amount of items we have brought in, how many people do we need to hire. So these are our methods of forecasting. And of course, we are going to use internet methods to help us. We'll be using HRIS because that helps us understand how many people have quit over the years. It helps us understand what skills are needed, the technological changes in the market, what are our financial sales and resources. So we put all of this information into computers these days. Okay, there's another kind of forecasting. So that's forecasting the environment. We also do what's called a qualification inventory. And this is about forecasting people. Now we're not forecasting only how many people are we going to need or how many people might quit, but we're also forecasting how many people right now in our company could we promote. So how many people right now are almost ready to become a manager? Because what we want to do always, if we can, is promote from within. There are many times that it's better to find someone outside the company, but when we're talking about lower level manager jobs, we're not talking about bringing in a new CEO. If Jack Carter is quitting the Carter Cleaning Company, of course he might elect Jennifer to replace him. But then if Jennifer needs a senior vice president, she might not choose somebody who's been with them washing clothes for years. She might choose someone who went to business school or had experience running a company like this before. But when we're talking about having division managers or lower level managers, managers of a store, at that point, we definitely do want to promote from within. And we don't want to have to think about who could be promoted. We already want to have these inventories, just like in a store, of people. What we're inventorying is, we know, because we did a job analysis, we know all of the KSAOs and KSAPs of a manager level job, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and personality. We have the job description. We have the job requirements matrix. We have the competency model. We know everything about this manager job. But what we also need to know is everything about the people we have, to see, do they have those knowledge, skills, abilities, and personality? Now, maybe they do almost, but they need a little bit of training. They don't really have the knowledge about how to do accounting or time management or how to fill out some of the spreadsheets, or, and that's fine. We can give them that training, but we have to know what training people need. We have to know who is available, who might be interested in being promoted. Not everybody wants that. We'll do an activity in class. We'll talk about that. We need these also because we need to know if somebody quits, who could replace people. So we call this a personnel replacement chart or position replacement card. And this is just a card that we have for each job. And on the front of the card, it would have the job description. And on the back of the card, it might have the people we think could do this job. Maybe we know what training they need, but we already have a plan. Good HR departments do not get totally confused and lost when someone quits. They are ready. That's their job. If an HR department gets totally lost when someone quits and doesn't know how to replace them, that obviously is not efficient. HR is really focused on not just waiting for people to come into your office and complain, but really knowing the human resources of the company, who can do what job, who's ready. So a management chart might look something like this. You have a division vice president, then you have a vice president in charge of production, a vice president in charge of sales, and a vice president in charge of finance. There are no recommendations for these two right now, but for this one, there is some development that might be needed for this person. If we want this person to do this vice president of sales job, they really need to do an executive development course in strategic planning. They really need to do some in-house development. They need to do some job rotation into finance and production. So right now, this person is not ready to go for this division vice president job. These two are ready. And that's really important for us to know, right? How is their present performance? What's their promotion potential? Are they ready now? Do they need further training? Or do they need improvement? Are they questionable, right? So this person we already ranked as, in terms of their present performance, they need improvement. In terms of their promotion potential, the square, they're questionable. We are not going to put this person in. However, this vice president, Mr. Jones, or Ms. Jones, excuse me, they have an outstanding current performance and they are ready now. So this person is probably going to be given the job. And that's a choice that HR was already prepared for. So that whenever the division vice president chose to leave or take a new job, or in the case that they had some sort of accident or couldn't come to work and had to leave the job, HR is ready. They know who is appropriate to fill that position, and that's really important. HR's job is also to keep all this data very safe, to make sure that background checks are performed on everybody, to make sure that we know who we can trust, to perform random checks such as drug tests or alcohol tests, to limit information such as health information. That's part of HR's job, is keeping all this. As we get more and more data on people, we need to keep it safe. Okay, so now we've done pretty much the first 3 steps, right? We talked about workforce planning, succession planning. We talked about forecasting. We talked about looking at the current market, workforce planning models, to see what kind of people are available in the area. And now we're ready to talk about internal and external recruiting. So we've talked a little about internally getting these personnel replacement cards together and making sure that you have a personnel chart. so you know who could replace who. When we want to recruit people from the inside of the company or from the outside, the most important thing is to have a group of people who want this job, right? So the more people we have, the better our choices are. Obviously, we talked last time about the hierarchy of goals. And so we know that HR is part of strategy for a good company, and that the CEOs are going to bring HR into their strategy meetings so that we know what the company needs. Now, the first thing we can do is recruit internally. Recruiting is critical, right? It's not just a matter of selecting people. We need to know how to develop this pool. And I gave the example last class of a time I worked for Alibaba where they did very bad recruiting and they just didn't get any talented people. Well, as I said, not only did that project fail, it cost them a lot of money because they had this big budget and they had hired people and they had rented this building and they did all this stuff. And then they just didn't have the right applicants. They had a good selection procedure, but there's nobody there to select. So in terms of leads generated, trying to figure out how many people could we target, that's a 6-to-1 ratio. For every 6 people that you target, let's say you put your advertisement on Craigslist, just some big, cast a wide net, target as many people as possible type thing. Or you put it on monster.com, or you put it on Higher Ed, or you put it on this semester, one of the presentations will be about job hunting websites. You put it on LinkedIn. You just cast a very wide net. For every 6 people who see your advertisement, only 1 might be interested. Candidates invited. For every 4 people you invite, probably only 3 will come. For every 3 people you interview, only 2 people might be good. And when you make offers to people, they don't always accept them. So in this chart, it's demonstrating that if you get 1,200 people to come and be in your pool of applicants, you might be able to take 50 people from that. So going through these steps, it's like having 1,000 people interview for a job might yield less than 50 qualified people you take. So we're really not talking about like that Alibaba thing. If you find 20 people, you can take 17. As I told them, if you found 20 people, you might be lucky to get 2 of them. So we call this the recruiting yield pyramid. This shows us from a pyramid, we start at how many people are in our pool of applicants. And again, we get that information from using our internet systems. All these people apply for the job, or they apply, they want to come in, they want to have an interview, they send us a letter or an application form or something, whatever we ask, and we get these numbers together. If 800 people applied for the job, based on this yield pyramid, maybe how many you could take, right? Out of this number of people, you have to, divide that by 6. This number, you multiply that by 3/4. Then multiply that by 2/3, then take a half of that, and that's your yield pyramid, okay? The yield pyramid tells us based on how many people actually are in our pool, how many people we might actually be able to take at the end. So that's pretty important. So now, where do we get these people from? Now, we already talked about having these cards for all of the people who work for us now, and that is internal recruiting. So obviously, it's very good. We need these records of the personnel so that we can do the qualifications inventory. The other thing that's really important is we need what's called a job board. So on a job board, this is where a good company has an internal method of letting the employees know that they're looking for people. So in the Carter Cleaning Company, how would they let employees know we have a manager's position opening up in East Newtown or, West Old Town? How do they let people know? Without some sort of method, you might have an employee who's worked for 3 or 4 years in East Town, and they would love to be a manager, and they'd totally be willing to move to Newtown, but they don't know. They don't know that job's available. And then you have Jack and Jennifer over in Newtown trying to find someone who's right for the job. And this is a huge problem because they don't have an HR system. And while Jack may think, oh, it's a small business, I know all the people who work for me, the fact is he doesn't. You know, he sees them for a few minutes when he comes into the store, and that's what he knows about them. He doesn't actually know their skills. They didn't do a job inventory. They don't know what skills are required for that location manager position. They didn't do a job analysis or a job description. They didn't do a job specification. They don't know who they want. And they didn't do a skills inventory for any of their employees. They don't know what KSAPs they have. They don't know who would be available and who would be suitable for that job. So Jack and Jennifer are missing this huge opportunity. And part of that, a job board does not have to be on the internet. I mean, it could be, but it could also literally be a board. That's what it used to be, that in one of the companies, you would just go in and you would see these advertisements on it. And they could put that up. They could post that in all of their locations, and that would be very effective. Now, when you're looking for people inside the company, really those are our two methods. One, job boards, so that people who work there can see what jobs are available. And two, having qualifications inventories so HR knows who could be promoted, who has the skills, who needs a little more training, who's ready and who's not ready. That's internal. When we talk about external, you know, obviously we're talking about the internet these days. You might also post things in magazines, in newspapers, at local places like supermarkets. There are often actual physical boards where you can post jobs. But of course, those are for non-exempt jobs. You're not posting something for a senior manager at the supermarket. You're talking about home pages. You're talking about internet websites, job domains, things like LinkedIn, or forgetting some of the really big ones right now besides LinkedIn and Monster. There's a really big one. Anyway, there's a couple of big, really big job posting websites. That's probably what we're talking about with external recruiting, or job fairs. Job fairs, virtual job fairs are also very popular. I know a lot of people who've gotten jobs that way. So, some of the big websites, Indeed, that's the one I was thinking of. Indeed, Linked Up, US Jobs, Career Builder, Monster, Simply Hired. I mean, all of these are these job markets where you put an advertisement out there and you can get hundreds and hundreds of applicants. So that can be very, very useful. Another option for external recruiting is going through social media channels, going through Instagram, Snapchat, WeChat, Weibo, Facebook, certainly, anything like that. I don't think Reddit has a job post page, but anything like that. These are all, there's a lot of pros. You can reach a lot of people. You can get more awareness of your social media. Part of the cons is that you never know who you're going to get. You're really, really casting your net out to anybody. And also, it takes a lot of time. Sometimes you really need a dedicated social media manager in order to not have these be buried under the constant barrage of social media tweets and information and posts that are coming out. Once we have, and we haven't talked about how to make the advertisement yet. We'll talk about that in today's lesson. We did talk last week about the job description. So we have from last lesson, we have all that information that we need to use to make the advertisement, but we haven't actually made the advertisement yet, but we will. You know, so once we have our applicant pool, we're probably going to put them into an applicant tracking system, especially if you have more than 20 people. These are not very expensive, these systems, but you can find free ones. Pay ones might be better if you have a bigger company. But when you're advertising on the internet or social media, you really might get hundreds of applicants. And at that point, it's important to be able to screen them, to keep track of them. You can do this by hand, and that's fine. But if you're talking about a lot of people, you might want to pre-screen with questionnaires. You might want to search based on certain skills criteria. You might want to use these to schedule interviews. So these are internet systems, software packages that you can get that just help you track applicants. Now we'll talk a little bit about how to make the advertisement. Now that you have this idea of how many people you think you might need in the future and what kind of resources you have right now, who's ready to be promoted, who's not, who needs more training, you know all about your resources now, and you have a good idea of how many people you need in the future. You've created your job board, so you're ready for internal hiring, and you've decided externally what websites or social media you're going to use. Now you're ready to create the advertisement. So we can talk more in class, we'll do a little activity, but what's the difference between an effective advertisement and a not effective, an ineffective advertisement? It has a lot to do with the information that comes from the job description. Also, it depends how much space you have. Right here, they're giving an example where space is not an issue, so you could write a lot. You can't always, but in most websites, you can write pretty much as you want. So here's an ineffective example. Now, why is this not effective? Well, we'll talk about this more when we are together in the Zoom class. So it gives some payment, right? It gives a range. It says immediate need. It says what qualifications you must have, and then it says to reply. Now, I don't think that's terrible. It's very clear. It's very to the point. But they would consider this more effective. So they give you sort of a tagline. You know, do you want to help make it a better world? Who are we? That's important. Because here they didn't really say anything about the company. We are. And they tell a little bit about the company. Who are we looking for? And then they say the experience they want. Some of this is a little disingenuous. It's kind of not believable. So I am not a fan of that. And I will talk in class about the difference between a good ad and an authentic ad. Because as someone who does HR and has worked with a lot of HR professionals, I think these days a key word for me is authenticity. I think authenticity is extremely important. So we'll talk about writing the ad a little bit more when we are together. But let's assume that we've already written our advertisement, and now we're deciding where we want to send our advertisement. So we have some choices. We have the internet. We have these online job fairs. We have social media. What about non-internet methods? What if we don't want 300 people applying? We want to be much more targeted. We don't have the time to look at everybody, you know, who saw our ad on the internet, who saw our ad on Indeed.com. We can go through employment agencies. That can be very effective because then they are going to curate or carefully choose a list of people for us. They'll give us a short list. We might also want to work with an alternative staffing agency, and they're going to find temporary workers for us. So that might be useful. Some of the benefits of employment agencies, we can be very specific about what we want. We can look for a public employment agency for state jobs. We can go through a nonprofit organization agency. We could go through a private agency. There are agencies that are just for management, just for law, just for accounting, just for computers, just for secretarial or clerical. There are a lot of different agencies that have their own focus. And that can be very useful for us when we're looking for someone. And we can also put an ad on the internet, but we don't want to forget about these agencies. Their whole business is headhunting. So I've had a bunch of friends who worked in the headhunting industry, and they have hundreds and hundreds of resumes and people who they've already interviewed, and they've already done skills assessments and qualifications tests. So they have a very good knowledge of what abilities these people have. And that can vastly reduce our time in HR trying to find the right person. In terms of contingent workforce, that's important too. That's thinking about different kinds of temporary workers. We might have part-time workers, we might have temporary workers, or we might have just-in-time workers. And that's workers who we might be splitting a shift between two different people, or it's modern to have one full-time job that two people do, things like that. And you can read more about that in the book. Alternative staffing, that might be outsourced jobs. If we're looking for alternative agencies, we might want people who are in a variety of countries. You want to use something like Sandbox. So there are a bunch of different websites where you can find people around the world. So and these days telecommuting and working from home, obviously it's becoming more reasonable and prevalent, and therefore you might want to talk about outsourcing or offshoring, moving your company out of the country it's currently in. You might want contract employees who are employees that are just on a contract for a period of time, like 1 year. And I'm not going to go through this too much, but the book talks about how you can work with recruiters if you're in HR. So you can make sure that the firm can do a thorough search. You can ask them about what they charge. You can meet the individual who's going to handle your assignment. You can agree what sort of person you want. You can make sure they vetted the candidate. Vetted means they looked into the background. Did they screen the candidate? And a lot of times they didn't. And so you want to make sure, if you're working with an agency and you're possibly going to give them some money for this, you want to make sure that they've done some background checks or vetting. And then, of course, as I said, you can find one that has special expertise, which is a huge benefit of using recruiters. Some other notes about external recruiting. You might choose to use referrals or walk-ins. That's where you have like an open day where you let anybody just walk in and have a quick 5-minute interview right there. Very similar to having going to a job fair, a real job fair, and just having these 10-minute or 5-minute quick walk-in interviews. Referrals are where someone who works for you gives you a recommendation. Okay, they refer someone. So college recruiting, also another great way to get people. Internships, great way to get people. You can target the military. We'll talk about specific targeting in a second. Telecommuters, already mentioned. The last thing here about recruitment, you can read this on your own. This is just mostly talking about the costs of recruitment. Is it more cost effective to advertise on the internet or to use a recruitment center? The cost of hiring people is very high. It costs a lot to train people. And when I say cost, I don't just mean the money cost, the cash. I mean, it's about profitability that's lost when somebody leaves and a new person needs to come in. Efficiency, productivity, all of these things sometimes have a dip. They go down because somebody who's been there for years has left and a new person is coming in. And that can cost the business a lot. Okay, so diversity. How do we recruit a diverse workforce? Well, remember, when we're talking about diversity, we are not just talking about racial diversity. We're talking about both internal and external diversity, surface level and deep level. So surface level, obviously, we might be recruiting a specific group, such as women, or single parents, or minorities, or people with disabilities. These are all very good tactics, because not that many companies are specifically targeting or recruiting these people. And some of you might say, well, but isn't that discrimination if you make an advertisement that just targets women? And the answer is no, of course not, unless you're refusing to hire men. How do you target minorities, for example? Let's say you want to target minorities. There are websites and magazines and TV stations and internet shows and all kinds of things that are meant for different minority groups, and then you would put an advertisement in one of those places. Now, does that mean you're discriminating against anybody else? No, of course not. You're just putting an advertisement in a place. It's no different than if you want to put an advertisement in a yoga studio that you're looking for managers for your company. You're going to get a certain group of people, the kind of people who go and do yoga. And there's nothing discriminatory about that. You're not saying I'll only hire those people. You're just targeting those people. There's nothing wrong with that. So there's a lot of benefits to targeting diverse groups, especially, Google did a really interesting thing in New York where in the subway stations, they put up a poster that had a math problem. And if you solve the problem, it gives you the phone number to call for the interview. And that was a really cool thing that they did. So when people took the time to figure out that problem right there, they got this phone number, and that was the first step of the interview. And that was really cool. Who are they targeting? They're targeting people who are good at math or people who take the time to do this, right? So that's a kind of diversity. Walmart targeted older people, people above 65, and that was very effective because nobody at that time was putting advertisements in things like the AARP newsletter. That's the Association for, I think it's Aged and Retired People, something like that, retired persons. But it's a big organization, millions of members who are at retirement age, so 60 and older. Nobody was really putting advertisements for jobs in those. Most people figured, oh, they're retired. But the fact is, a lot of people later in life are still working. And Walmart had a huge advantage as they were the first movers to do that. So, okay, these are all types of people we can hire. We could hire internally, externally, with the internet, with different websites, with social media, with hiring agencies, with college recruitment fairs, with all kinds of diversity hires, with having an in-person walk-in day. And then we talked a little about how to create the advertisement, though we'll talk about that more when we're together. Now, once you have a bunch of people who want the job, the next thing to do is to have everybody fill out an application form. So there are a couple of reasons that we want the form. We don't want to just waste people's time, but we do want to know about their work history. We do want to know their identity. Now, a lot of people complain that if you go and look for a job, a lot of times you send them your resume and then you have to fill out a form that has like the same information as your resume. And you say, well, they already have my resume. Why do I need to type out my work history? I already did it. And the answer is because these application forms are usually done on one of these applicant tracking systems. The technology is not there yet to scan your resume and have that information suddenly be uploaded to the applicant tracking system. We do need applicants to enter that data. We get a lot of information from looking at a resume, but people make decisions very quickly. You take one look at a resume and you kind of decide, does it look good? So much of it has to do with your use of space, color, organization, what stands out, what do I see first? If I'm in HR and I'm looking at hundreds of resumes, I'm not going to sit down and carefully read each one. If it looks bad, I'm not interested. There's just so many people. So a lot about resumes is really, it's not about what catches the eye, it's about the journey that the eye takes. So if I have 5 seconds to look at your resume and I look at it, where does my eye travel? Like, what do I see first, second, third, fourth, done? That's about it. I'm going to give you 5 seconds and look at your resume. But that's 5 seconds. That's not 1 second. I'm not just going to look at it and throw it away. I'm going to give it 5 seconds. What stands out? Is it your job? Is it your education? Is it some award you won? Is it some amazing sentence about you? Is it some very clear statement of what you want? So later in the semester, I will ask everybody to write resumes, make sure you have them, post them on a LinkedIn page. I will ask everybody to do this because I think it's very important. And I think now is a good time to start working on your resume, but we're not quite there yet. So we have application forms because we do want to know people's work history. We want to know things like their education, their experience, their emotional stability. We get that more from tests. Their references, that's very important. A lot of companies in China do not vet, V-E-T-T. Vetting is where you actually contact someone's references. So I have had plenty of jobs in China where they never contacted my references, and I think that is just crazy. You never know who's lying. You never know what people are saying. I worked in one job in China where there was a guy who worked with me who, there was something very just off, something wrong about him. And it turned out months later, he got in these huge arguments with people, and almost, he didn't actually hit anybody, but he was pretty violent. And when the school finally called his references, they found out he had been fired from every previous job he had for being violent. This is a school. How did they not call his references? But they didn't. You know, it's really, really important to actually check references. And in fact, what I do in HR is I would not even call your references. What I would do, well, I would, but I mean, what I would do is I would call your reference. So let's say John is applying for a job. There's nobody named John in our class, but I don't think. But let's say some guy named John is applying for a job. I call up his reference and I say, hi, is this, Mr. Richardson, you're John's reference? And they would say, yes. And I'd say, can you please tell me someone else who worked with John who I could talk to? Somebody who John didn't tell me to call. Because obviously Mr. Richardson is prepared. Look, all of my references are going to say good things about me. So I don't want to just talk to my references. I want to talk to people who I didn't put on this list. But of course, it depends on the job. It depends on, how serious you are about background checks. We also want to be careful on the application form of things we can and can't say. About education. You can ask about education, certainly what schools you went to, but you have to make sure you don't ask questions about like the racial composition of a school. You cannot say like, was this an all-white school or something like that. You can't ask about arrest records. You can't ask about membership. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Socialist Party? You can't ask about marital status or handicaps or housing. We have to be very careful about asking for video resumes. It's okay, but you really open the door for claims of discrimination, because if you're using videos, you can actually see people, where with resumes, you can't see anything about what they look like. Okay, once we have our application form sort of prepared, the next step is to get ready with the interview. So there are 3 steps for us to get ready with the interview. Step 1 is we need to be familiar with the job, of course, because we're going to interview people. Step 2, we need to review the application they sent, and let's talk about what are we looking for. And then step 3, we need to plan our questions. Studies have shown, and we're going to talk a little more about interviewing, I think, next week, but studies have shown that an interview that is structured, that is planned, is far more effective in finding the right person than an open interview. An open interview is like, hey, tell me about yourself. How you doing? You having a good weekend? Let's just chat. Let's just talk. That doesn't work very well. It depends, of course, what kind of job you're looking for, what kind of person you're hiring, what kind of position you're trying to fill. But for the most part, we want structured questions. So step 1, becoming familiar with the job. Well, most of this is the job description. So in HR, you are familiar with the job because you have a job description, job specification, job requirement matrix, and competency model. You have these 4 things with you. So you know a lot about the job. But things we need to know about the job, such as what kind of duties and responsibilities does the job have? We get that from the job description. Education. How is this job related to education? What skills and knowledge are needed? And why are these skills and knowledge needed? Why couldn't someone without these skills and knowledge do this job? Are these skills and knowledge consistent with the duties of the job? Are they consistent with the law? So we need to really make sure that we understand when we're asking people about education, they can say, well, excuse me, David, you're asking me about my university education. How is that relevant for this job? I need to be able to answer that. I can't just say, oh, you're going to ask me questions? Well, I'm the one giving the interview. You're out of here. Can't do that. I can be sued for doing that. They could say I'm discriminating against them. So I need to be able, like an adult, to justify the questions that I'm asking at an interview. What intangible requirements am I asking for? Attitudes, creativity, personality, initiative, reporting requirements. So that's recording requirements between positions and between individuals. So between positions is, who do you report to directly? Who do you report to indirectly? Who reports to you? What's the relationship between this job and a manager job? And then between individuals, what's the style, the management style of the manager of this job? So who is, if you get the job with my company, who's your boss going to be? So I'm interviewing you to become manager of this branch of the Carter Cleaning Company. I need to tell you what Jack is like, Because if I tell you, maybe it won't work with you, maybe that's not the kind of management style you're looking for your boss. What are the traits that your boss values? That's really important to talk to somebody about these relationships. Who are you in charge of? Who's in charge of you? What kind of person are they? What kind of person are they looking for? More and more in the modern world, you really need to choose the right manager for you if you want to be happy at work. And that's a very good question for someone to ask, maybe a little less so in China, but certainly in the West, it's very reasonable to say, I'm interviewing for this job, I really am interested in this job, but I'd like to know a little bit about who my manager will be, what their style is, and what kind of traits they look for. I mean, that's a great question to ask, because if the HR doesn't know, that's a huge red flag. I mean, just a real problem if HR doesn't know who you're going to be working for and what they're like. The environment, the exemption status for the FLSA, whether or not you're required to join a union, all important things you need to know before you do the interview. Finally, salary. As I said, even if I don't talk about it in an interview, I need to know what the salary is. And I can never, as an interviewee, I can never say, oh, just pay me what you want. Or it doesn't matter, it's my first job, I just want an opportunity. Those are not reasonable answers. Do your homework, find out what the salary range is. And then benefits. Interviewers, in fact, should have a short 1-minute presentation of here are the benefits of the job, what kind of medical benefit there is there life insurance, are there any sort of profit sharing or any stock sharing, what are the vacations, personal days, holidays, is there a tuition reimbursement, anything like that. You absolutely have to know when you're looking to hire people. And then finally is growth opportunities. So how often will you get an appraisal? Will your boss come and talk to you about the job you're doing every month, every 3 months, every 6 months? How often will they review your salary? How often will you be up for a promotion? How often will you get a training? These are really important things for an interviewer to know and to talk about. And all of these things we're talking about are actually fantastic questions to ask. When the interviewer says, do you have any questions for me? The answer is always yes, you should. You should have questions for them. And these are great questions because they really show that you value yourself. They show that you're not just begging for a job, that you really value your growth. And you want to know how often you'll be appraised or evaluated or what kind of trainings there are. It's not just about the money, it's about what's the likelihood of promotion and how long does it usually take and things like that. Okay, once you're familiar with the job, you're going to review the applications of all these people who are going to come in for an interview. So you never want to repeat people's information. And a lot of times you see this in an interview where you go in for the interview and you gave them your resume, you did this online application, and the interviewer looks at your resume and says, you went to Donghua, oh, I see. Oh, you worked in, you had an internship at whatever financial company. Oh, it's interesting. And it's like, what are they reading your resume right now for the first time? It's very frustrating. So good interviewers have already read your resume and they know a little bit about that when they come in. Now, I'm not going to say, oh, it says here you went to Donghua. You went to Donghua? What, am I stupid? Of course, it says you went to Donghua. Oh, it says you worked in finance. So what was that like? I mean, that's not a real, it was fantastic. I loved it. That's why I'm looking for a new job. I mean, come on, those are not real questions. Those are terrible HR questions. The kind of things we should be asking people about is, for one, the overall appearance. Is it grammatically correct? You don't need to ask them that. You can just see. But any blanks or omissions, any gaps between jobs. If you didn't work for 2 years, I can see what you did the other times. I want to know about that space. What were you doing then? If you went to university and then 7 years later you went back and finished, okay, cool, I can see that, but tell me about it. I'm not looking to have you repeat the information that's on your resume if I'm an interviewer. Accuracy of all these dates. Any inconsistencies. So, it says here you have a master's degree, but it also says for the last 3 years you were working in a supermarket. Can you explain that? Because you had a non-exempt job with a sort of exempt education, the educational level. And I mean, these are the inconsistencies that you want to point out. Interviews are not meant to tell you nothing as the interviewer. Anything else? The frequency of job changes, of course, how many jobs have they had in their life and why do they change often? What kind of salary they're looking for, why they leave their previous job, and anything that makes you feel uneasy. As the interviewer, anything that you feel like that's kind of a red flag, I just don't know, you ask about that. Okay, the third step is to plan your questions. So we don't want to have 25 questions we're going to ask. We want about 6 questions. It's okay if, the first question is open-ended. That's okay. But what we want to do from there is maybe listen to their question and use it to ask the next question. So, for example, if I said, please describe your activities during a typical day. Oh, well, I come to work and I check my email, I answer some emails, and then we have a meeting at 10 o'clock, and then at noon I have lunch, and then in the afternoon I usually call some of the customers and I fill out the order reports, and I might say, okay, good. Tell me a little about that meeting you said you have at 10 o'clock. Try to go at least one step into their open question. Don't just ask a question and then, okay, great, sounds good. Okay, now let me talk about something else. You said your hobby is tennis. You good? I mean, come on. You got to ask an open question and then continue in that open question. In the American Management Association, there's some examples of recruitment type questions. They talk about Hallmark and Chiron and GM. We'll talk about that when we're together. But they're talking about strategies of asking questions. And you want to know when you're going to ask your questions, so how much money do we have available to hire people? How quickly do we need to hire people? Do we want to reach a wide audience? And is this person, do they need to be exempt or non-exempt under the FLSA? So we want to make sure, because recruitment can be very expensive. So we want to know how much time do we have when we're planning these questions. Can we do 3 rounds of interviews? Can we only do 1 round of interviews? Do we have the money to give people the taxi fare to come and do an interview? I mean, where are we at with everything that allows us to do our interviews? And once we know all that, then we can really plan our questions. So there are 5 kinds of questions that we can ask. Open-ended questions, I just said, are very, very general, right? Something that's, describe a typical day. So let's go through these 5 types of questions pretty quickly. So a competency-based question first. That's asking specifically about a very measurable skill, for example. So tell me how you would design a web page. That's a very specific, if you don't know how to design a web page, you can't answer that. Or I've had people ask me, tell me how you would prepare a class if you only had 20 minutes to teach. Tell me how you would prepare students to get better or improve at debate, right? That's a very specific skill that, they want to know if I have that competency. And so that question asks about a certain skill or a trait, and you can see how effective a person either has been in the past or how they'll perform in the future. That's competency. Just asking about a very specific knowledge-based thing. Can you tell me how you make steak au poivre? Can you tell me how you'd make a cappuccino? Can you tell me what is the best way to handle a customer who complains that their food is cold? Can you tell me how to handle a customer who says that the clothes you washed aren't clean enough? What would you do in this situation? It could be something that's hypothetical. It could be something that's real. Tell me about a time when a customer complained about the quality of your work. Just give me an example of a time when your boss was not happy with your work and how you reacted to that. Describe a situation when, about 70% of the interview. So this is really the core of the interview is tell me about times when these specific things happened. And they're all going to be about the KSAPs that I need for this job. Open-ended, like I said, tell me about a typical day. What do you do when people aren't happy? This is maybe 15%. This is used primarily when I want to ask you a big question and then go another level or two into the question to really see how you answer specific questions. Hypothetical questions, what would you do if this happened? How would you handle this? This is not going to be a big part of the interview, but this is to see how people reason, what's their ability, or maybe what's their value. You know, what would you do if a customer came in and used a racial curse? They said a bad word to somebody on our staff, and you're the manager. What would you do? Would you call the police? You know, I'm not asking you if it happened to you. I'm asking you what would you do if it happened? And that's to see their values, their reasoning, their attitude. What's their thought process in that? That's more for a hypothetical question. Probing questions are really very, very specific. So why would you do that? Tell me more about when you call the police, what would you do when they're on their way? What if the customer wouldn't leave? What would you say specifically? What exactly would you say? Just really kind of digging, a little bit. We don't do that too much, but we can. And then finally is closed questions. These questions have facts, right? Did you finish college? What was your major in college? What was your last job title? Those are just, they have an answer. These aren't thoughtful questions or hypothetical questions or asking about skills. These are very specific. I want to know a fact. There's two other things to talk about. One is documentation, and that's to make sure that as an interviewer, we are keeping very detailed notes. Why? Because these notes actually become a permanent record of the interview, and they can be used for evidence in law. If we're sued for any reason, one of the things that the lawyer will request is the interview notes. So we want to keep interview notes because we put it in someone's file and it stays there for like 10 years. So we want to make sure, and we'll do an exercise with this when we're together, but we want to make sure we're using objective language and not subjective language. So subjective means something I believe, but it's not what the whole world believes, it's just what I believe. So if I wrote like, the applicant is really sexy, well, you can't write that. But you can't even write like the applicant is very pretty. That's my opinion. And you really shouldn't be writing opinions. What you could say is the applicant's appearance is consistent with the image desired by the company. That's not my opinion. That's the image desired by the company. And if you're in HR, you sort of learn this language of speaking without saying your personal opinion. We do this in law too, right? We do it in sociology sometimes as well, that we don't want to talk with our personal opinions. So you might say, the candidate was dressed in a manner appropriate for work, as opposed to the candidate dressed well, because dressed well is my opinion. And we'll do an exercise with that. Make sure you don't just give opinions that don't have facts. If you want to give an opinion, make sure you back it up with facts. So if you want to say he would be a good manager, you have to say he would be a good manager because 3 years previous experience, has an MBA, worked in the cleaning department of his last company. Okay, that's 3 reasons you would think that this person might make a great manager. But you can't just say he wouldn't be a good salesman. You have to say why in your notes. The final thing is the orientation. So when you're interviewing people, after the interview, you are going to maybe need to do a short little orientation. We'll talk about this much more when we get into training, because I consider orientation to be more of a part of training. But there's generally 2 kinds of orientation. There's organizational and departmental. So for organizational, it could be a half a day. It could be multiple days. This is what HR does. Toyota has a 3-day one. And we'll talk about this more later, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But what you're really doing is you're letting everybody know the overall view of their company, telling them about the place, the building, the land, the surroundings, what's around, making them feel like they belong there. and what the job has to offer them. Then there's 6 main topics that we're going to talk about in our orientation. And that is the history and function of the company, the philosophy and goals of the company, basic industry information, so not just our company, but our competition, the industry, things like that, our organization structure, what we consider to be good performance, our expectations, and then finally, what we do for the employees, what we give you, your benefits, any other services we have, like daycare, education, things like that. That's the organization. Then in a bigger business, when there's also departments, you might have a separate orientation, the specific responsibilities of the department, who you report to, your specific duties, any schedules or rules in this department. Okay, so I know that's a little rushed. We'll go through it all again together, but that is recruiting. And so after this, we can then move on to the next step of staffing, which is selection. Okay, and I will see you guys in class.